Yeah. Young man, always surfing, no waves. I do it for the kids.
All for the youngest. Young man, always surfing, no waves. I do it for the kids.
They wanna know who I do it for. I do it all, do it for the kids.
Well, hey kids, welcome to the Daily Snack. My name is Jeff. Thanks for choosing to come and hang out with me a little bit today. If you didn't see yesterday's episode of the Daily Snack, go back and check that out as we kind of got to know each other a little bit with a game called Two Truths and a Fairy Tale. You can learn something about me on there, and we're going to be introducing all of our team on that over the next several weeks. So go back and check that out, though. It's a great way for us to be able to get to know each other. Now, on to continuing with the greatest story ever told. And last week we looked at the opening scene of our story and saw that we're all in need of rescue, but that God has a plan. And today we're going on to chapter 2 of that greatest story ever told. And it's all about invasion and escape. Man, we're going to learn all about how the people of Israel were constantly kind of picked on by their neighbors. And some of it was self-inflicted. Some of it was because they weren't obedient to God. But they were constantly under pressure and duress and people picking on them. And God stuck with them every time and helped them escape every time. And we're going to learn a big point today. I introduced this last week. It's that God takes care of his people. Now, as we look at the Bible, this greatest story ever told, we learned last week, and I'll keep reminding you this, it's not just a book. It is the greatest story ever told, and to help us understand what happened and when and how it all fits together, we started a timeline last week. You can go back to Tuesday's episode last week on the Daily Snack and look at the beginning of that, and we're going to continue that today and see how, like I said, all these stories fit together. Now, after the book of Genesis, which is the beginning of all things, we get to the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and Joshua. And the story zooms in on the life of a guy named Moses at the time when God's people, the Israelites, were in slavery in Egypt. And the book of Exodus begins when Moses was just a little baby, and it follows the incredible story of how he grew up to be used by God to rescue the Israelite people. God took care of his people. He even parted the Red Sea so that they could cross on to safety. And as they traveled through the desert with no map, God sent them a huge cloud to guide them by the day and a pillar of fire to guide them by night. And he provided food for them in the desert. He provided water for them. He provided the 10 Commandments to guide them on how to live. Actually, way more than 10 Commandments. A whole list of ways to live life and do life God's way. And he led them through the wilderness to a land that he promised them, something that we call the Promised Land. And then a guy named Joshua takes over leading the people after Moses dies, a nice old age. We discover that God provided for his people when he made the sun stand still so they could win a battle. He made the walls of Jericho, this enormous city, just crumble as Joshua and his army sounded trumpets around it. The book of Exodus, through the book of Joshua, they show the constant faithfulness that God had to rescue his people, from Moses to the 10 Commandments to Joshua and the walls of Jericho. These 4 books showcase God's incredible plan to rescue his people. The Bible, it's not just a book, it's the greatest story ever told. So let's get into that story right now with some rhyme. I'm going to show these on the screen and I'm going to read them along with you. Here we go. God's people were slaves in Egypt for 400 long years. They toiled under Pharaoh and shed many tears. God had a plan in motion to see them set free. One day they'd escape from Egypt across the Red Sea. Baby Moses floated in a basket down the river one day into the home of Pharaoh, where he would then stay. Many years later, at 40 years old, Moses would depart, not knowing all of God's plan, but following his heart. Years later, God spoke to him from a burning bush. God had a job for Moses to do, and he needed a push. Take off your sandals. This is holy ground you tread. Go to Pharaoh. I'll be by your side, God said. Moses, filled with courage, spoke to Pharaoh with God's message saying, let my people go. Each time Moses asked, Pharaoh always said no, and God would send Egypt plagues and woe. First, the river flowed with endless blood, red. Then came frogs on every path they tread. And after that came gnats spread everywhere before swarms of flies filled the air. Still, Pharaoh's heart wasn't moved. Even though God's power had been proved, all the animals across Egypt fell gravely ill, and boils broke out as Pharaoh said no still. A thunderstorm of hail drenched the land, and locusts came when Moses held out his hand. Darkness covered over for 3 long days. Pharaoh was amazed at God's strange ways, and after all this, the Pharaoh had been worn down. He let God's people go, get them out of town. They would soon be free to follow God's lead as he showed them which way to proceed. As God's people came to the shores of the Red Sea, Pharaoh changed his mind. Don't let them flee. They had to escape before the soldiers chased them down. God's people shouted, how will we cross? We'll surely drown. God said, Moses, lift your staff and the waves will part. It happened as he said, and their escape could start. They could all cross the Red Sea on solid, dry ground. Behind them, Pharaoh's soldiers were all drowned. We've escaped Pharaoh, and now we're all free. God took care of them and parted the Red Sea. Through the wilderness into the promised land, at every step, God provided for them from his hand. It's an amazing story. It's just one of the stories that we see in these books through Exodus and Joshua, where God miraculously provides for his people. That's really what we're learning. God takes care of his people, and he did that, 3,000-4,000 years ago. But guess what? He still does it today. Actually, even longer than 4,000 years ago, but he still does that today. God takes care of his people. He took care of them. He'll take care of you. It's such a good thing to know. And so let me give you kind of one of the smaller points we have before we leave here today, as we learn this big point that God takes care of his people. But let's talk about from Pharaoh to let's go. I used to be a professional promise breaker when I was a kid, and I suspect some of you might fall into this boat too. Let me give you an example. My mom would say, hey, Jeff, would you clean up your room? And I would say, sure, Mom, I'll do it right now. And then 10 minutes would pass by. I'd still be sitting there playing my little Atari video game. Pac-Man would be crossing the screen, and Mom would say, hey, would you clean that room? And I'd say, sure, Mom, I'm on it. Just let me finish my game. But I wasn't on it because the game just never finished. And when Pac-Man died, you could always restart, right? There's lots of promises out there in the world, and some of them are big and some of them are small. But there's one promise made by God a long time ago. And it has a lot of people wondering if he'd come through. Let's take a look at the stories found in the book of Exodus and on through to Joshua in the Old Testament. At the start of the book of Exodus, God's chosen people, the Israelites, were in slavery to the land of Egypt. They'd been there for not a couple years, not 10 years, not 30, 40, 50 years, 400 years. Family after family was born into slavery. No one knew what it was like to be free anymore, but they still lived with a hope. The hope that one day they'd be saved by God, just like he had promised hundreds of years before. He'd send someone to save them and deliver them. They held on to God's promise tight to bring them into a land of their own. Over 5 books of the Old Testament, we see God's plan unfold. The main character is a guy named Moses, who comes back to Egypt to confront Pharaoh and tell him the famous phrase, let my people go. And this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go so they can hold a festival in my honor in the wilderness. There were plagues and frogs and problems for Pharaoh. Eventually, all the firstborn sons of the whole land of Egypt died except for the Israelites. And finally, Pharaoh let God's people go free. Moses lifted up his staff and got part of the Red Sea so the Israelites could escape from Egypt after Pharaoh changed his mind and chased after them. They headed off into the wilderness in search of the promised land. And over the next few books of the Bible, we see how God guided them there safely, even though they constantly disobeyed and whined and complained and just did goofy things. God was faithful to them. God takes care of his people. We can see through the lives of the Israelites what's true in our lives true. God takes care of his people. Well, tomorrow on the Daily Snack, we're going to be back to talk about this a little more. We're going to check in with Dan and the other characters at Big HQ. We're going to see who got in the limo next. If you didn't check out the first part of our video last week, you can go to last Wednesday's edition of the Daily Snack and check that out. And then get ready. They're riding in the limo on the way to the movie premiere. Who's getting in the limo next? You can find all of that out and talk more about how God takes care of his people tomorrow on the Daily Snack. Can't wait to see you later. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Young man, always surfing, no waves. I do it for the kids.
All for the youngest. Young man, always surfing, no waves. I do it for the kids.
They wanna know who I do it for. I do it all, I do it all, do it for the kids.
They wanna know who I do it for. Yeah, I do it all.